Okay, that's working well now. Okay, fantastic. Okay, I suppose I should go back over. So we're being recorded, everybody online, so hopefully that's okay for you. What we're going to do is we're going to, if you can go to minty.com and enter that code, there's a code on the screen. You'll be asked for a reference code that will take you to the questionnaire page, and you'll just be given some opening questions. We're really relying on lots of audience participation for this to work well. So if you could go to that, and there will be opportunities to put questions in on that platform as well, and we'd be really interested to see what your responses are. Okay, so I can't see results on this. Okay, right. So we are getting word clouds. I mean, surprisingly positive. So the biggest word is excited and curious, and there is a large contingent who are worried and concerned, and it's changing quite a bit. Nervous. I think a lot of us can relate to a lot of those emotions, particularly those of us who are doing education and preparing for a term in September in an era of code interpreter in ChatGPT. Okay, so shall we move on to the next question? Okay. The next question is, have you used ChatGPT or a similar generative AI? And we'd be really interested to find out, how many people have dabbled. I think in general, it's a pretty good idea to have a look. And the vast majority are certainly dabblers, have used it or similar, and small few who have yet to take the plunge, which is really interesting. So the question from up there, is there a problem? No, we're keeping the results over here. So the results, in order to avoid distraction during the discussion, there will be opportunities for questions. So we're just doing a few icebreakers. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next question. How often do you use ChatGPT or a similar generative AI for work? It'd be interesting to find out. So the most common response is sometimes, right down the middle. And it will be interesting to find out from those of you what your experiences are. I was on an interview panel recently and managed to get a question on the use of ChatGPT in, and it was wide-ranging how people are using it in different ways. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next one. Do you think generative AI will make your job easier or harder in the future? And again, there's a few answers. And there is, curiously, a lot of people answering both. I think we should do a qualitative study on. Okay, so people, it's bimodal, I would say. Most people saying easier and some people saying both. So people seeing lots of positives with ChatGPT and AI, but also is maybe being seen as a double-edged sword where there are potential issues coming up. Okay, and I think, is this the last question? Or that was the last question? No, okay, fantastic. Yes, so we're going to allow people to pop in questions as we're going through. So you'll be given the opportunity to ask questions of the panel. And I was going to start off with just sort of an interesting opener. I'm not, so with there's people from widely different backgrounds here, but I would be very interested to see what the initial thoughts are from the panel of what we think the near future of AI might be. So what are the things that we can see coming down the line, and particularly maybe with reference to your area of expertise. So maybe Robin, would you mind kicking us off with thoughts about what the near future of AI is going to be, and what's coming next? And I think you might need to hold that up like that.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think in the field of law, particularly, there's a lot of interest in AI, particularly to automate certain kinds of routine activities. However, that's also raising some serious concerns, one of which is, of course, how do we train junior people when we give them the sort of, routine automated skills? And so I think, finding the right positioning of AI in certain fields and certain disciplines, I think is going to be one of the critical next steps for AI.
Pass on. We pass this on, pass a little bit on. Okay, so I'll talk about the economic perspective. And what's maybe interesting from one of the interesting things from the economic perspective is what type of tasks is AI going to replace? So do we think of AI as helping us make goods and services? Or do we think of AI as helping us make ideas? And it turns out that the economic growth implications are vastly different depending on how you think of AI. If you think of AI as generating, helping us make goods and services, then maybe it's a little bit more of the same, of this long process of automation that we've experienced, and some tasks that used to be done by humans are now done to computers. From back in the day, you could think cultivation, or maybe secretaries doing calculations. They've been replaced by tractors and computers. Now with ChatGPT, we see maybe entry-level service positions are immediately at risk. To think of maybe paralegals or copy editors, but you can think of further in future, maybe drivers will be replaced with driverless cars, and that's a bit of the promise. But if all it does is replace, help us make goods and services, then it's continuation of what we've seen, and the past is a good indication of the future. And if you look at the past, the problem with the economic growth is that despite having automated a lot of, say, agriculture and manufacturing processes, we haven't seen economic growth shoot up in a significant way. It's rather stayed relatively stable since pretty much the Industrial Revolution, and if anything, declined a bit in the last few decades. And the reason of that is you start hitting problems of, in economics, it's called Baumol's cost disease, which basically says that economic growth is not determined so much by what you're really, really good at, but increasingly is determined by what you're not very good at, but yet it's essential and very hard to improve. So think of agriculture has become very productive, manufacturers become very productive, but as they become more productive, they become a smaller chunk of the economy. And a larger chunk of the economy are these things that are very hard to improve and they're very essential. Think of health services, education services, government services. And that turns out to be, the actual drag. So there's limits to, that's the counteracting force, if you will, of you can automate a lot of tasks. As long as you don't automate 100% of it, then you actually start hitting maybe more of the same in some way. And there's maybe this whole talk about AI is nothing but more than a continuation of what we had. But if you think of maybe AI is replacing or helping us come up with ideas, then you get different vastly implications for economic growth. Maybe it's helping the creative process or taking humans completely out of the idea generating process. And if so, you can actually create scenarios, almost science fiction type of scenarios you can start considering seriously, such as fast accelerations or even what they call singularities, infinite growth in finite time and these kind of things. But of course, there's the reasons to be suspect about if you can ever achieve these things. There's limits on, fully automating every single task. It would require AI to actually replicate human intelligence. And there's serious concerns that AI might never reach all the series of cognitive tasks that would be essential to do that. There's also, some people argue that ideas are getting harder to get. So maybe there's at some point some finite set of ideas. So think of a pond of ideas. Even if you get very good at fishing them, eventually run out. or even natural laws. You start hitting against those. You start hitting against, say, the second law of thermodynamics tells you that we're pretty close to achieving full energy efficiency. And there's, you know, a natural law that you just can't get, might not be, can improve, or, you know, or I think when I'm using AI, the one I think is I would never use this unsupervised. I'm happy to use AI for, you know, maybe copy editing papers or these kind of things, but I would never reach the point, because of the nature of the algorithm. It's a probabilistic algorithm. It's going to make mistakes every now and then. Because it makes mistakes, I would never, for important things, I would never let it run unsupervised. And so those are the limits. But yeah, but basically from the point of view of economics, it depends how you think of AI.
Thank you very much. I was struck by social media recently, and there was a comment made about how we should be training AI to do things that humans don't like to do. So at the moment, we're teaching it how to do poetry and do drawing and all sorts of things that humans actually enjoy, and we should try to automate the tasks that we don't actually like. And so in terms of your perspective, what would you say the near future of AI looks like?
Right. So one of the main points I think that needs to be done is to distinguish between these two views of AI. One as an agent that does things by itself, and one as a tool. And so my perspective is that the systems we have in the foreseeable future will be tools. And as tools, it's very exciting. They will offer this opportunity to work as multipliers of human knowledge processing. So individuals will be able to do more faster at a cheaper cost or effort. So they're incredible multipliers, and each one in its own domain. So there's a general usability in lots of different domains. So as a tool, then it's morally neutral. So people can use it to do something good, or people can use it to do something bad. So you can use it to create mass campaigns of disinformation, or you can use it to check that cyber threats, or on vast scale be aware of dangers. So the interesting thing is that it is it is spreading to all sorts of domains. So while before it was a bit of a niche kind of thing, but now because we now have this natural language interface and people can just interact with the system just by talking or writing, it's becoming vastly adopted at with a huge speed. So that's interesting. So we'll see these applications in all sorts of domains. And again, it will simply be a sort of, a very willing to follow your instructions kind of assistant that you can apply, on very different type of tasks within your own domain. So you will be able, for example, to ask it to use the formal tools that you use in your discipline. So a biologist could use it to run programs that are a bit complicated, and just by saying, I would like, these are my constraints, come up with something, and then the system will interface with the tools that are specifically made to solve exactly, without any probabilistic or whatnot aspect to it. Then, so these tools will be just this glue between different systems, or this translator or interpreter of, human constraints and desires into more formal settings where other tools will be more suited.
So you might have some. Oh yeah.
Thank you. So I guess my perspective comes from the philosophy of science. I'm really interested in science and research and technology. What would be the potential near future prospects there? And I would say the way in which it may change our work and the work of our colleagues in natural sciences, I would see it as, at least in the near future, being very much to do with education and with background research. So to some extent, I would agree with what Fabrizio was saying. This is going to be about the tasks that are more formalized, that actually can be then very easily kind of allocated to a sort of computer helper, so to speak. And so I think in education, we're going to see enormous shifts. I mean, just, you know, I'm sure many of you saw that panel that happened a couple of weeks back of basically a press release done entirely by robots, obviously powered by generative AI. And, you know, as much as there are obviously huge issues still in getting proper functionality out of these kinds of tools, certainly the idea that you may well be able to put together a first-year undergraduate course, which is run mostly through generative AI, I don't think is that far away, actually. So these kinds of things are something to really think about, and they can be, you know, very positive, very negative. Questions around indeed looking for background materials, doing research in that kind of pedestrian sense, I think is also already proving to be working in some way, with lots of problems, with misinformation, with, you know, errors, but still kind of something that can at least help in some respects. What seems to be pretty clear, at least so far, is that when it comes to cutting edge research, that's just really not where this tool can be particularly helpful, partly because precisely the kind of automation and standardization that these tools promote are to some extent almost antithetical to what may be thought of as scientific understanding, right? So the kind of you know, breaking through opacity, at least every now and then, at least to the extent that you can try and innovate on processes that you're using to get to a particular result. I mean, most of us who are doing research are not that interested in the result per se, but interested in the process through which you actually get to a particular result. And that's something that I think, thinking about generative AI and certainly large language models, we are not at all in a world where those are going to help directly to achieve that kind of research level. Obviously, many of the things that they can do as background can, you know, make these processes more efficient. But again, with risks and problems that I'm sure we're going to get to discuss shortly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. That's a fascinating range of perspectives. I'm really pleased to hear you say about the you know, potentially as a preparatory kind of research tool. We've the Open Science team, I'm going to take an opportunity to plug. The Open Science team have paid for an institutional membership for Cite.ai, which is an AI assisted tool which will assess the claims in a given paper and look at other papers that cite that paper to identify whether that claim is supported or not supported. So that'll be a tool that the whole university will have access to from yesterday. And there's a launch event next week, which you won't have heard about because it's not been advertised yet, but it's happening as we speak. So really, really interesting. There's if you go onto your Mentimeter, and I might pop up the code as Miriam suggested on the wall in a second. If you do go on there, there is questions, and what I'm planning on doing is that you can give up weights to some questions, and whichever ones get the highest up weights, I'm going to go to those. I am going to steal another question if I can, though, and I might go in the same order if that's okay, Robin. Sorry about this. So you're right on the cutting edge all the time. What I'm interested in is, do we feel, from your discipline perspective, are we prepared for this change in how society works, in how education works? Are we prepared, and what would it take for us to be prepared if we're not? So you can, if you go to that one.
Yes, that really is the question of the day. Are we prepared? Are we ready for this technology? And I think there's an interesting aspect to this. So we have this technology. We know that it has risk. We know that it hallucinates. We know that it has, you know, inaccuracies, that it can be unpredictable at times. And yet, and still, it's in circulation and in use. And more than that, it's without oversight, without regulation, generally speaking. And so we're finding ourselves trying to contend with technology in circulation, in use, that is not regulated, even though we know it carries risks of harm, some of which are extremely serious. In fact, if you look at the EU AI Act, well, the current proposal, the way that they are trying to address generative AI, for example, is through their general rubric of risk stratification, where there's unacceptable risk, high risk, and so forth. And generative AI, but it's based on the risk stratification is based on the intended use. And so generative AI, which is general purpose AI, how do you risk stratify that? So you can talk about what's the intended use. So education typically falls in high risk. Well, so if we're talking about the use of generative AI in an educational setting, then there are certain obligations that have to be considered, similarly for health and so forth. And so, until we actually get some regulation in place, I think we're going to be sort of in a no man's land, if you will, sort of uncharted territory where everybody has to be on guard. Everybody has to be, is this real or is this fake? Is this, is somebody pulling the wool over my eyes? As a professor, I read papers, and you can't help but wonder from time to time, has the student used generative AI? And what's wrong with that? We haven't, as a society, decided what's wrong with that. I can offer my own thoughts on this. And I think as a society, we will get to that point where we make it very clear what's wrong with that and what are permissible uses and what are not. And so when I started in your first question about what's next, I use the word positioning, and I think that's the critical term here. How do we position the technology? Not do we use it or not, or do we regulate it or not? It's how do we position it so we actually do yield the benefits and minimize the risk and harm. Because we haven't done that yet, we're not really ready for this technology. And so something needs to happen very quickly. And I have a lot more to say on this, but I think my colleagues have a lot to say to it.
Thank you. So maybe something I'll bring is, you can think about AI as a tool, as Fabrizio mentioned. But I mean, something in the very long term, something that makes AI different is presumably the potential gains and the potential losses are much larger than other general purpose technology that had come before, like nuclear, right? When the disaster scenarios that some people in the computer science community take very seriously are at the level of existential crisis, extinction events, and we're not very well designed to quantify those types of risks. And so it's going to take a little bit more of working on how do you decide on something that has so much potential benefits and so much potential downside, and so obviously you can try to minimize the potential downside, but will you take that gamble of and it turns out, well, if you actually work it out through probabilistic models, the answer is not that clear. You can actually, if AI gives us all it gives us is more consumption, maybe not. Maybe it's not worth it. You get satiated at some point. That's so much you can consume. There's so much richer it can be. But what AI does, it helps us to battle cancer, and it helps us to live longer and reduce mortality. Well, it turns out that gamble is actually much different. It's much more attractive. You would actually take much higher, that you take that bet with higher probability, because then it's almost in the same units. It's existential risks versus higher living longer and less mortality. So that's one way maybe to think of but how AI is different, that really the upside and the downside are potentially both very, very large and larger than things that have come before. But I think your question was more related to the day-to-day. And are we ready to face those risks of AI? I mean, from education sector, I mean, it seems we have to adapt. And the question everybody asks is, do we still is asking students to write essays is still is that okay, or should we maybe move on and ask them to get ChatGPT to write the essays, and then the critical thinking part is the thing that they really need to teach students. Now that anything can be, they can generate a entry level essay. So are we ready? Are we ever ready? Or just slowly adapt?
That's a very interesting perspective. There is the term, we don't want to be Luddites in terms of, this is a new technology, but it is kind of prescient that the Luddites were cotton mill technicians who damaged expensive equipment in protest at their jobs being lost. And the Luddites did eventually lose all of their jobs. Their protests, they were prescient. They knew what was coming. Okay, I'm going to pass on. Sorry.
So the question was, are we ready, or how are we? How can we integrate in the short term the use of these generative systems? So one of the biggest questions is, how do we represent, or how do we consider how to work with these systems? So it is a bit of a change with respect to what was before. So before, we had these AI systems that could be used as predictors. So you would say, I give you a picture, and then you have to tell me if that's a picture with cancer, yes or no. Or I give you text, and then you have to tell me whether this is a positive or negative sentiment, and I know that. And so that was the old way. And then nowadays you have this generative approach, and now that's very different, because the way you use these systems is you have to think of those as sort of a generalized optimizer. So you give what you want to optimize your objective function using words. You give your constraints with your prompt, and then the system comes up with a solution that satisfies your constraints. And so, for example, you could say, well, write me a plot of a detective story, and then the system does that. Now, what people are, so while the previous systems were easy to use in the sense of, I give you the picture, you tell me cancer, yes or no. Now, these generative systems, they require that people start having a completely different mindset to be able to use them. And we have to train for that, but that's possible. So the first thing is, if you give a very stereotyped kind of question, you will get a stereotyped kind of answer. So it will give you the most banal detective story plot possible. But of course, you're not limited to that. Those systems are very powerful, so you can really go into the trying to offer more and more context. So you can say, look, I'm going to get me the detective story, but also use these characters. I'll give you a description of the characters. Start in this setting. Use this style as a writer, but not only that. So now, after you've written your plot, assume you are this famous critic. Criticize all that you've written. Now integrate all the comments of this critic and rewrite completely the story and iterate through this process 5 times. So the way in which you are using these tools is more into trying to specify the processes. You can specify the process with which you want the system to acquire data, and where to find resources, and how to evaluate the quality of the response, and how to integrate the results into a coherent whole. So you have to be able to specify those things, because otherwise you get the same stereotyped one answer, which is trivial and banal, and everybody can do it. And so there's nothing that you're putting of yourself into that. So that's the first thing that you have to learn how to do. The second thing is you really have to be on the defensive, to have a defensive mindset. The system will make mistake. The system will hallucinate. We will say something that's completely wrong. How do you defend from that? So you have to develop the mindset of really thinking in terms of providing ways to ascertain whether things are right or wrong. So sort of right unit test, so that you check that what's coming out is truthful, which is a whole mindset which is not standard. So provided that we can start training people to see the systems for what they are, is sort of a generalized human language interfaced optimizer, then sure, people can make great use of those tools and use them to come up with some interesting novel thing that can be very valuable in their specific domain.
So I suppose one final point in addition to everything that's come up so far, who is the we who's supposed to be ready here is, the big elephant in the room all the time. So yeah, I mean, maybe I am ready. I mean, I am a professor. I've been looking at this stuff for years. I'm really excited by the potential. Sure. But there are, quite a lot of problems for quite a lot of other people in adopting this. I mean, I think already what Fabrizio said was extremely useful, because indeed, what does it take to get different types of users to take advantage of these systems in these ways is actually rather enormous as a trajectory to try and think about how will people approach these kinds of tools. And so this is problem number one, is usage. But the other problems are, of course, input and development. And both of these issues are just as big, right? So input, we all know we are in a hugely asymmetrical, humongously unfair and inequitable data landscape, where what we have information on that can be used as training material is very skewed towards very particular groups of people, particular types of activities, particular types of objectives. And using simulation data, contrary, I think, to quite a lot of the rhetorics in this field, really is not helping, because simulation data and artificial data are modeled after the data we already have. So if anything, they actually make the gap between some parts of reality and, our data landscapes even bigger. So there is a real issue around how does one even conceptualize something like misinformation in a situation of this kind. And then there is a question of development, which is who is actually in charge of developing the various algorithms that are going into producing these models, and therefore favoring certain kinds of goals against certain kinds of functions, certain kinds of analysis. And again, I mean, this is where I think there was an interesting series of articles in Nature a couple of weeks ago. You may have seen discussing, for instance, how problematic the doomsday scenario is when one considers questions of development, because it's so easy to say, oops, this technology can destroy humanity. What are we going to do? And then, of course, Google comes with a cape and says, we'll save you. Don't worry. We have the expertise. We have the money. We're going to come in and sort it out. But this is a very, very problematic state of affairs, where you have a situation where you kind of conceptualize a whole set of technologies as an existential threat to humanity. And the only group of people that seems to be positioned in a way to actually have any power over that technology are very large corporations based mostly in the West, right? So I think there are very serious issues around what does it mean to be ready at the moment, given these issues. I'm sure we come back to some of this.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go to the top questions from the audience. Now, this is a democracy, and the top voted question, I'm going to read it out and then offer the panel to see who wants to address this first. I think you started to address some of this, Sabina. How much of current AI is enabled by click workers, and how will this develop in the future, and how is this process regulated? So does anybody have a burning desire to address that comment? How much of current AI is enabled by click workers, how will this develop in the future, and how is this process regulated? And
Something like that.
go for it.
So at the beginning, when these systems came out, so the various the various GPT versions before the chat version, they were capable, and they could generate things, but with very mixed results. Sometimes very appropriate things, sometimes very inappropriate things. They could easily be swayed to tell you how to build a bomb, or things that the companies that were making these systems didn't want to have those systems tell the general public. And so then what happened was they said, well, we are going to use, the carrot and the stick, and we're going to rank the answers. And so there is where we had a huge influence of humans. So there was this reinforcement kind of setup where humans were tasked with 4 specific questions, rank the answers, and say this answer is better than these other ones. This is more appropriate. This is more safe. And so deciding the rank, deciding what is appropriate, deciding what is safe, then of course is the company that did that with directives, and the humans, lots and lots and lots of humans that were paid to re-rank these kind of things. And then eventually the system was released with as ChatGPT, being able to be, have a safe conversation with the general public. So there's a huge influence.
Does anybody else want to come in on that particular point? Otherwise, I can move on to the next one. So this is a question about environment and climate change. So I'm curious to know about environmental and climate change impact of using large language models and ChatGPTs, which I assume would require super mega data centers with energy consumptions going to the roof. So environment and climate change, given that that's one of our flagship themes in the university. What should the university be doing about this, I suppose? So what is that impact? Does anybody want to say anything? No. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So the same, as a tool, you can see the downside. We can also see the upside. So it's true that these systems are much more expensive to use in terms of energy usage, electricity usage, and that's one reason maybe that it's not being widely deployed at the moment. You need only Microsoft, or the reason why OpenAI, one of the reasons I had to pair up with Microsoft was to get this type of capacity to be running in the background. So it's very expensive in energy usage than say a regular Google search. But on the other hand, getting climate models, computing climate models to the point that they can be helpful in predictive analysis is also an extremely expensive task that we need to tackle before we can, be able to know, get better answers on how to address climate problems. So it's both. You have more expensive technology doing things that help us do very good things, and how do you make that trade-off? You have to kind of make that gamble. Do we go down that path and with the potential downside and the potential upside, or do we not? Then presumably climate change, it's another existential crisis, right? So we probably want to tackle it. But what if doing so itself contributes to it? So that'll be my perspective.
So yeah, completely agreed. I mean, I suppose the question for me that is always, again, maybe a bit of a problem in this respect is that indeed, I mean, there is more and more research on environmental problems that come with energy consumption for sure. And of course, we are all rather worried at the extent to which being able to make more accurate predictions has any impact whatsoever on any actual decision making, whether it's in economic or in political terms, as to what is actually done about global warming and climate change. So there's a question mark as to whether, having much better prediction is that really going to help? And I guess, I mean, again, pointing to some of the asymmetries here, I think it's important because we have a situation where, in fact, we're almost like, a almost full-blown economy. And I'm sure actually Julian would know more than me about this around the treatment, the production and treatment of data that then fuels these kinds of models, also when it comes to environmental issues. So on the one hand, you have basically calibration, sentiment analysis, kind of click, whatever. Economy, typically based in the global south, more and more kind of very, positioned in very particular ways in relation to the mainstream tech industry that commands some of these predictive algorithms. And on the other end, you have, yes, potentially more and more accurate predictions, but about which parts of the world and for which particular topics, which are going to be the sanctioned topics, which ones are going to be the ones that actually nobody really wants to hear about. I mean, we are trying to do some work at the university for sure with the CDT and other things, produce a whole generation of researchers that can think properly about this type of issues. But I think we really are, I mean, at the global scale, this is a real issue, not just the fact that there is an energy consumption relating to the use of generative AI, but what is actually applied to, where and by whom continues, I think, to be part of the climate crisis and perpetuating some of the inequities that are perpetuating that.
If I may add something, but there couldn't be some hope, along the line. And so one of the things, of course, is, technology evolves. And so these models are going to become cheaper and cheaper. Already there are versions that are streamlined and they run on a single GPU and you can run it at home. So eventually things will improve. And so the actual energy consumption will not be a problem. And the other thing, which is actually probably positive, is the notion that once the cat is out of the bag, meaning the systems have shown that they are very capable. Of course, true, they've been trained on this vast quantity of data, but now that people know that it's possible and have recipes and have seen how to do it, it becomes easier and easier and easier to replicate that. And so people are already talking about having regional versions of the systems where, regions of governments say, okay, these are the data that we want to base our systems on. And so then you can have at a cheaper and cheaper, ever cheaper cost, things which are more and more localized. Now, if that will give rise to a balkanization of AIs that are, speaking dialects and are of a particular political leaning or another, we'll see. As always, humans find ways to make things more complicated.
Fantastic. I'm going to continue with the next question. I think this is quite interesting. Should text generated by generative AI have a watermark embedded so that we can be aware when we're reading this? And is it possible? So I teach on a large master's program with 90% international students. And I recently had I thought a brilliant use case, an email from a student that was perfect prose, captured the questions that they wanted to ask. And at the end, they wrote in, I explained to ChatGPT in Chinese what I wanted to ask, and this is what it gave me. And I was able to have a really productive, clear, fruitful conversation with this student in a way that I think that student would have struggled to do otherwise. So, I really appreciated the declaration, and I thought it was fantastic. So should text generated by generative AI always have a watermark, and is it even possible to do such a thing?
So a watermark is a tool of disclosure. And that's sort of getting at one of the big concerns, which is that this is deceptive. This has the potential to be very deceptive. And so watermarks, which are not foolproof, I mean, they can, a tech person can explain, can be removed with considerable effort. But the question is, what are we actually trying to achieve with the use of a watermark? And are there other means by which to do this? So it gets at the question, it gets at the issue that's at the heart of a lot of the talk about regulation of generative AI, which is being able to distinguish that which is real from that which is generated by AI, that which is original versus that which is generated by AI. but it basically comes down to a disclosure tool, and the focus there is on transparency. And transparency, as we all know, is a very highly valued attribute, particularly in today's world. And certainly in the educational context, we need to know this. I heard recently someone compare, all the hoopla about generative AI to, well, did people discuss whether or not we should use calculators or spell check? And the answer is no, unless it's a spelling test, unless it's a math test. So what is the objective there? And so using a watermark, that can be a solution, a technological solution. We use this code, to enforce the law, but it's also a very short-sighted one. And if I may just quickly bring this, so there's several horizons to regulating generative AI. There's short-term horizon. We want to prevent this kind of behavior, but there are also the long-term horizons. And the last question that was posed regarding climate change, I thought was a really brilliant example of how we have to keep these different horizons within view in crafting the regulatory landscape, and I'm using that term broadly, to how we want to govern and, again, position this technology going forward.
Anybody, any further thoughts on a watermark? Go for it.
Yeah, so apart from watermarking, technically is a bit tricky to do with text. What you can do is you can ask all companies that are providing these services to keep a track of what they are generating. And so you probably could ask them, did you ever generate this thing? So, but not in the text itself. So the text itself will not contain any way to mark it as being generated, yes or no. And then, of course, if you generate it with your own system at home, then it's that cannot work. But the idea is probably a regulation issue. Is you could be mandating the fact that you have to disclose if you're using the systems, yes or no. You have to make sure that these systems cannot pretend that they are humans generating things, so that are writing blogs, and that could be made illegal. So you're going to punish the people or the companies who are doing it, not the technology per se. So it's like counterfeiting money. So you could do it, but then you go to jail for 20 years. So you could write a blog post as using AI, and then you go to prison for a few months. So that could be a way.
Maybe like one final question I think comes out of the watermark discussion in a really nice way could be, to which extent, which is a much bigger question in a sense, to which extent do these systems need to be anthropomorphic, right? Do they need to be anthropomorphic? We can almost give it for granted. Yes, of course they do, because that's how we can use this in most friendly ways, right? But this is not absolutely obvious, right? There's been a backlash against ChatGPT being the kind of system that seems to emulate a chat, like as in, a messaging service between two humans. And there is a big question, I think, that is raised by the watermark issue and regulation, but also the scientific employment of this. Like, do we want to have systems of this kind that are programmed to emulate the human, or would be much better to assist them? Don't try to do that, actually make it explicit that the logic that they're adopting is quite different. They're working quite differently. They require us to think differently, right? I think that's an interesting one. And with watermarks, on the one hand, they help to kind of, put in front of us the fact that this is not quite a human we're dealing with, or at least it's not a human product in the same way. But at the same time, they could also just normalize this, this particular use of text, which comes with its own problems.
Thank you. So I'm going to gratuitously abuse my chair's privilege now and go to a question that I have for the panel. And I'd like the panel to picture themselves in a hypothetical scenario where 10 or 20 years hence, we're seeing a lot of information at the moment saying that AI is going to revolutionize everything. And I think it is used as a marketing tool by some of these big corporations. They want to hype their products. And so we do hear a lot about this. But picture yourself in 10 to 20 years and everything is the same. AI has not revolutionized everything. Why would that be the case? What would need to happen for such a reality to exist in 10 to 20 years? Nothing has changed. Does anybody have anything that they would want to say about that?
Yeah, so again, it's a tool, and so has drawbacks. It can be, it's all shiny new tool, new toy. You use it. Already, they already have seen that people have stopped interacting with the ChatGPT after this huge surge, because sure, you can, say, write me the instructions on how to change VHS using the style of Bible speech. Fine, you do it a few times, and then you move on and do what you're paid for in your normal work. So it is a tool. As far as it can be used to improve things, it will be used and it will stay around. If, for example, all this thing of having a cheap way out of doing things, out of thinking or out of writing, if that's how people think about using it, society will react, professors will react, and we'll make sure that no, you cannot get a diploma or a degree by cheating your way from the beginning to the end just by using the systems instead of thinking. So eventually we'll adapt to that. So that's not the way to use them. So indeed, it will be used as a tool, and we'll see how good it is. It's, how, as any predictive tool, it doesn't have 100% accuracy. And so also in the generative space, it doesn't come up with completely innovative ideas or solve any possible kind of question in a creative way. So we'll see how good it is and how people can really use it.
I suppose the, rather depressing scenario could be this becomes the equivalent of when TV first came out and you have just one channel, because you just one set of advertisements and one set of programs. Meaning if the interactive element fails completely here, following on from what Fabrizio was saying, then you could imagine a reality where, this particular pharmaceutical company has kind of won the bid for being the people who are mostly advertised to generative AI, like the model standardized towards a particular outcome. And then, yes, when you say, what would be the best drug for me to heal my headache or kind of tackle this particular form of cancer or whatever it is that I have that is worrying me for my health, then you will get always the same standardized answer, exactly the same way as we would have, 60 years ago watching TV and seeing always the same advert come through. That's a very kind of, that definitely is a doom scenario, but I don't think it's completely impossible.
I think Robin was going to.
Yeah, so if we looked 20 years down the road and we found that nothing had changed, even though, we have this revolutionary new technology, and I think my response would be that because we didn't get the regulation right. And the reason I say this is if the technology develops in a way that is inconsistent with or contrary to our values, to the values of a society, the values that support society, that cause it to function, then we're going to run into very serious problems. At a certain point, people are going to rebel. There's going to be an unraveling, perhaps. And so the question is not, I think, is partly can be, what happens if nothing has changed in 20 years, but what happens if we're worse off in 20 years? And again, my response is the same. We didn't get the regulation right. Did we get regulation in place that effectively supports the values of a given society? Do we have our objectives clear? So when we talk about the use of generative AI to write essays, it's not just about writing an essay that we're concerned about, that as professors we're interested in doing and developing with our students. We're looking at things like analytical skills, research skills, planning, organization, and so forth. All of this goes into it. What is the objective? Are we sacrificing, these kinds of concerns for developing, responsible members of society for the sake of convenience, to do things faster, for efficiency? And we've done that before. But thinking, as I said earlier, there's a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term vision, and all of this has to stay within view when we're starting to craft regulation. And so if we're either at the same place or worse off, I think the answer really will be we didn't get the regulation right.
Well, I'll add another perspective. I think if AI doesn't amount to much in a few years' time, another way to think about it is because it hasn't become science. Right now, I mean, the comparison maybe with nuclear energy is appropriate. The way we got our handle on nuclear reactors, we were able to harness the positive part of it because what we understood, not me, but physicists understood the intricacies of the nuclear generation process. AI right now is far from being anything close to science. It's more of we know it works, and it works wonderfully, and it's funny, and it can do all these things, but we have no idea why it works. And similar to the watermark idea, another idea has been floated is, well, maybe we shouldn't proceed with AI until AI can tell us how it got to the answer it gave us. It can, I mean, with essay writing, it's impossible to get AI to tell you which sources it used. And if you ask, they'll give you your sources. It makes up sources. It makes fake sources. It gives you outdated sources because it doesn't really know what sources it used. And if you talk to computer scientists, the view is that by the very nature of AI, it's hard to backtrack the process. It's a probabilistic process. It's easy to, you can write it such that given some sources, it comes up with the best answer, an optimization algorithm, but it cannot backtrack of what then were the probabilities that were used to assign to each different, you say, the next word in a sentence and why it chose that word. And if AI amounts to nothing, is because and it's a very kind of one of the big main challenges of AI is we don't understand it. Nobody understands it. And if you don't understand it, it can never in some way become like nuclear, that once we understand it, we're sure with the right safeguards in place, we can generate, almost infinite amounts of clean power with no side emissions and maybe fusion and these things. So, but that maybe is the constraint that I would be at the forefront of my head.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go back to democracy. And the top rated question that we haven't answered, is there any contingency prepared in the case of the ChatGPT spreading misinformation from being fed false information by users? So is there any contingency that if we feed false information to ChatGPT, that we could kind of trick ChatGPT into giving us wrong answers? Do we know of any sort of any?
Well, one thing we know is that is not that every time we interact with ChatGPT, all these things are going to be necessarily used to train the next generation of ChatGPT. So one of the current things is to be able to filter very aggressively the data sources that are used for training the systems. It's been shown that, the higher quality the source is, the less you can have. So rather than having all exchange of information or all chats with people on Reddit or whatnot, you get a few good books. That's going to be better. And so there's that aspect. The other aspect is, I think more and more systems will pop up. Now everybody was talking about ChatGPT was the first one, but nowadays on the landscape there are serious contenders, things that work as well as ChatGPT. More will come up. Bloomberg made one only for financial stuff and said, that's all for me. Google is doing one for medical literature, medical advices. That's one for me. And so, yeah, these systems will be trained on very selected type of information. A lot of thought will go into that, and that will be their value. So, yeah.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, I completely agree that the more specialized, the better in terms of actually controlling the kind of information these systems are built on. But let's not forget that BARD is now basically ubiquitous. Certainly in Europe, is being in most of continental Europe is now already been integrated in the main Google engine, and is now still separate in the UK, but it's coming, right? So, using this stuff as all-purpose tools and searching tools is basically already happening. And that is already, there's already emerging empirical evidence around this just amplifying political bias in a way that we still haven't seen. I mean, if you thought that Facebook gave us Brexit, then, let's see what's going to happen in the next 2 years with BARD giving us goodness knows what around the next elections in this country or pretty much everywhere else, right? So I think, I mean, as much as it would be great to be able to have a kind of nice and clear-cut dividing line between kind of more scientific subject and medical subject and what is going on in the political arena. I mean, we know that that's going to be very, very hard. And when looking at the all-purpose systems, I mean, my worry is that these are going to be the systems that are going to be used like really, on a mass scale. And the kind of the smaller ones, may well become the domain of specialized professions, and it would be great because then everybody finds ways to use these tools in ways that are helpful. But the question remains: what do we do with the all-purpose search tools, which are built on, house of cards of data, basically?
Sure, I'll just take the opportunity to beat my regulation drum just a little bit longer. And a key part of this, I mean, the user purposely feeding incorrect data is a really interesting phenomenon. And I think one of the key aspects to getting regulation right is allocating responsibility correctly. Who is responsible? Who should we hold responsible when a user purposely supplies incorrect data? Can we, go around policing the users who do that? Or do we have to use it in look to the developer, the deployer, and so forth? Where on this chain do we allocate responsibility? How do we maintain accountability for these systems? And so again, we've got to get the regulation right.
Very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next top-rated one. This is the highest-rated question we've had so far. Do you think that large language models on the level of ChatGPT-4 or above should be open source? Anybody want to come in on from a...
Yes, it's very, very obvious. So, I mean, absolutely. I mean, having some transparency around how this stuff is being developed, who's responsible for what, and reactivating the open source discussion, I think is critical and fundamental to this whole enterprise. But, and of course, OpenAI is not open. If anybody in this room doesn't know it already, which I hope you do, is absolutely not open. So, that's not a good example. But yes, I mean, that would be the desirable thing. And we very, very much hope that the open source community can catch up, which they're trying to do. It's a hard thing to do when the stakes are against you. But, fingers crossed. That's my perspective.
No, so of course there's risks. So what people say, why is it controversial at all, is because, of course, you're saying, well, you're giving the capacity to build these systems, which can be very powerful and therefore can be used by bad actors. But again, the issue is regulations. So the technology is out there, so you can't limit it now that it's available. And so it's better to have lots of systems, each one built according to the whoever interests, but then to have a regulation that punishes the illegal use of this system. So if you use it for spreading misinformation, they'll come after you. So sure, again, it's a tool. Everybody should have it, because the problem is what happens when only few companies have it. and then they decide who uses it or how it can be used. So that's on the negative side. So indeed, more eyes scrutinize things. It's been proven that, you know, open systems are more resilient than closed ones.
So I would say that making these systems open and open source is an essential step in understanding them, and understanding them is an essential step in making this more of a science rather than a tool that works amazing and nobody knows what. So it's essential. If it's ever going to pass that threshold of, you know, that's the joke that the AI is defines everything. We don't know how it works, and then if we know how it works, it's called machine learning. So, you know, to getting to make AI more of a machine learning rather than these big unknowns, it's essential. Or else, you know, you brought up, if you really don't know how it's working, how it's doing what it does, eventually bump into regulation. And some regulation that will force it to, okay, essentially tell me how you got the answer you got, and then I'm comfortable enough that, yeah, I'll be able to create. So it's an essential step. But yeah, there's the trade-offs of, should everybody then, I mean, replicability is essential for science, and so that's another way of seeing it. But should everybody have access to it, rather than a scientific committee that can, you know, sit down and figure this stuff out before a bad actor gets its hand on it? That's I think it's a fair question. Everybody needs it, or just benevolent few? Not clear to me.
Okay, so I'm very keen that we leave you wanting more. So what I'm going to suggest is that I take one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to have one final question. So there'll be two further questions, and then there'll be opportunities to mingle out in the foyer, I'm sure. So what are we doing to educate non-experts on the potential risks? Are the young generation going to develop a reliance? Are the young generation going to develop a reliance on this technology? What are we doing to educate non-experts on the potential risks? Or maybe what should we be doing? Anybody want to come in? Anybody first? Sabina, you blinked first.
Because there's so many things one can do, right? I mean, one of the things I've done the last couple of years is work on a children book that's only available in Italian. We'll translate it in English. But I mean, for instance, kind of presenting children with fantastic representations of different beasts, which are actually different types of algorithms, so that they start to understand some of the dynamics and the thinking behind some of these machines that behave in a way that's kind of anthropomorphic, but actually have all sorts of issues and can help you in some ways and not in others. But yeah, I mean, it's, I suppose, especially as educators within the university, that is a huge responsibility to try and reach out well beyond university students, and, you know, and really try and talk to people in different ways. I mean, there's no perfect way, right? It's going to range from using social media in particular ways to developing every now and then working with organizations externally to create videos or material that can be put online and people can consume beyond the university world. Getting involved in community chats about this. I do that every now and then, like, you know, people get together, you know, just, you know, I don't know, in a parish or like in a municipality to talk about these things, disappear and take part in that. But I think every possible level of discussion around this would be really helpful at this stage.
I can say something. Yeah. And so again, I think one thing is, of course, to become savvy, and if, you know, before regulation takes place, we're going to have this Far West, and there will be some time, and in that interim, there will be a lot of fake generated stuff going around, and so people will adapt to that, and we'll see that yes, we are bombarded and we are drowning into generated things which are have no relation with reality, and so you have to be, you know, aware of that, and you have to try and become smarter and trying to identify the sources and where things are coming from. Eventually, hopefully, things will move into ways to certify where things are coming from with different technical solutions and with different legislative solutions where you're saying, that's forbidden to spread false things. But indeed, these are tools. And so we will need to start teaching how to correctly use them and how to see, the output when they are used, how to identify those.
Any response for here? The question was, won't someone think of the children?
Won't someone think of
So the question was, are the young generation going to develop a reliance?
reliance? Yeah, I think a number of things can be done. And I think one of the critical ones, certainly in the context of the university, is that, we not take the ostrich approach, where we stick our heads in the sand. It's wrong, it's bad, don't use it to write your essays. The fact of the matter is, as you say, as everyone has said, it's a tool. One of the things that I think we have an obligation to do is to decide how we can best use that tool, offering the community tools of discernment with regard to the use of it, with regard to assessing, evaluating outputs and so forth. So it becomes a really sort of developing awareness, at the very least, I think is an obligation of the university. And I would certainly actually even go further, that there should be attention given to developing a certain sophistication with regard to this rapidly rising technology. The second point I'd like to make just briefly is that we are living in a society, in a world where there is a significant digital divide. This digital divide translates into health technology. So we now have differential uptake of health technologies along the lines of the digital divide. So what happens when we introduce, this generative AI on a large scale in multiple sectors, and it's available to some or taken up by some and not by others? Are we looking at a scenario where we're widening, exacerbating existing disparities and inequalities? So it's this multiple horizon planning for the integration of this technology.
Maybe what I have to say a bit about inequalities. Again, we think of AI simply being an extension of automation. We've had 2 centuries of automating things, and the fear in some way was that machines would take over everything that humans do. Or I think it was Keynes that was credited for thinking that perhaps we will have leisure and have machines working for us, some sort of Jetson type of future. But the reality is that if you just think of what percentage of economic tasks are doing by computers, by capital, how much are you doing by humans, that has stayed pretty constant for a very long time. And the economy has a way to, come up with new tasks for these people, for the people who are at this place. The secretaries in Hidden Figures that got displaced by computers, they bear the brunt of the technology of computers, but the next generation, that whole occupation, computer used to be a job description back in the day, and so protecting the jobs shouldn't be the role of society per se, but it should be smoothing out, or distributing the. We know some jobs, some sectors are going to be affected more than others, and there's a role there to make sure that the people who are being affected more directly are also compensated for reaping the benefits from AI. For some sectors that are doing that, there's an argument to be made that some of those gains should be redistributed to these to the secretaries that have all these computing skills that nobody needs anymore. So in terms of inequality, maybe it's not. We should look back, and this is an old argument. It's not like all of a sudden computers are going to take over, but inequality is always, that's just in terms of economic growth and inequality. There are losers and winners, and there's a role for society to smooth that out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, I promised you that there would be one final question, and I was vaguely expecting that the general discussion would be slightly gloomier than it actually turned out to be. I think there is a general concern about what can go wrong with AI and how things could pan out in a slightly negative way. I would like to ask as a final question to all the panelists, what are your main reasons for being cheerful about AI? So what are the things that make you happy when you think about AI, if there is anything? So does anybody want to go first?
Well, I'm just happy at all the things I can do now with ChatGPT. Well, not even with ChatGPT, but I work a lot with programming economic models that are computationally heavy, and AI, just not ChatGPT, but there's a whole area of optimization algorithms that have been using artificial intelligence algorithms in the background, and they work. They're faster, they're better. They unlock a whole set of problems that I can look at much faster, much better. And I ask myself, well, I don't understand how this algorithm works, but it gives me the right answer. And I'm constantly asking myself, is that okay? Well, it's the right answer. So, I means I can look at that problem and write that paper. So that, I get excited about these things. And on a personal level with ChatGPT, I've been asking it to comment my code, which is necessary, is this part of non-essential, time-consuming, but something good practice that people should do with their code is explaining what's going on there before you send it to a journal, so it improves readability, improves replicability. I don't want to do that, and ChatGPT saved me so much time in just reads the code, comments it out, saving me lots of time. So I'm a user. I'm a maybe user is the right word.
Well, I'm at the gloomy end of the panel. And I think when pushed and asked what makes me happy when I think about AI, I would have to say, and with a certain amount of giddiness, is the potential, the promise for the use of AI in healthcare. I think the potential is enormous, both in terms of ongoing care, future care, prediction, prevention, and so forth. So I think there's enormous potential. The other aspect of this is that, there's been a long history of health disparities. And it's being recognized when we're talking about how we develop and integrate AI. So it's actually an opportunity to change the script, to change the trajectory going forward. So yeah, this makes me really, really happy. And that's spoken from the gloomy end.
So I'll repeat myself in the way I opened. So these systems are becoming better and better at working as multiplier. So you will be able to do things that used to take a team of people, now a single person can do. Something that would take years, now you can do it in a month. And that's getting faster and faster. And so we could get to the point where good news is, coming every day. So you could have advances that before, especially in the biomedical sector, would take years. And now they're going to take much less. So it could be to the point that you say, okay, there's this incurable illness or disease. Okay, well, next week, probably, it's going to be solved. So eventually we'll get there. So these are fantastic tools. Things are just could be, let's see, start moving at an incredible speed. Now, these are tools, so in interesting domains, this will have wonderful beneficial effects. The fact that you can spam the entire internet with misinformation, that's something that has to be, of course, fighted and avoided with necessary regulations.
I guess, like my colleagues, I'm extremely excited, of course, about the potential to work within projects where, I'm working with people that I trust. I'm working on a corpus that I can check. And at that point, really, the advances, the potential is enormous. So, of course, I'm very excited about that. I suppose my commitment at this point, like being extremely pessimistic about how this is going to develop on a broader scale that goes beyond me or, this university or what we can do as individuals, would be to try and really take a stand on the project that I choose going forward, making sure that they really are very purposefully looking at places where big corporations are not going to invest. So is there going to be, and there already are movements towards, for instance, really thinking about generative AI for orphan diseases. Great. Like that's going to take my vote. I mean, I think especially from people who are working more in the public sector, more in academic sense, potentially, a little bit more accountability for trying to, be on the other side of what Robin has indicated is an increasing gigantic digital divide around who is going to be benefiting or imagined as a beneficiary for these kinds of systems and what we can do to try and address that balance a little bit at least. So it's kind of optimism within the gigantic pessimism.
That is fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to thank all of our speakers and thank everybody online for the fantastic questions. I think what we should probably do is try to collate some of those and maybe incorporate them in our newsletter with maybe some key responses from the panel if they would be willing to provide some. Thank you very much for everybody showing up. I mean, I think this has been really, really fascinating. I think we could have one of these every 6 months as ChatGPT and large language models, increase and improve. So thank you for everybody for your engagement and your attendance. And can we all thank our speakers, please? Thank you. Class dismissed.